What started as a routine morning of plowing turned into Kansas's most shocking cold case. When Farmer Tom Mitchell's blade struck something that shouldn't have been there, he uncovered a 22-year-old lie that would destroy 3 families and expose a web of murder, betrayal, and buried secrets. In the small town of Millfield, some truths refuse to stay buried. Prepare yourself for a tale of greed, guilt, and the deadly price of keeping secrets. Hit subscribe and let's uncover the truth together. Let's begin. The rusty plow blade hit something that shouldn't have been there. Tom Mitchell felt the jarring thud travel up through the tractor's steering wheel and into his weathered hands. The John Deere lurched to one side, nearly throwing him from the seat. He'd been farming this same stretch of Kansas soil for 37 years, knew every rock and root by heart. This was different. He cut the engine and climbed down, his boots sinking into the freshly turned earth. The morning sun cast long shadows across the field, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called out its liquid song, but Tom barely heard it. His attention was fixed on the furrow behind his plow. What he saw made his stomach lurch. Pale bone jutted from the dark soil like broken teeth. The femur, by the look of it, long and thick, unmistakably human. Tom had seen plenty of animal bones over the years, had helped neighbors bury cattle and horses. This was different. This was a person. His cell phone trembled in his dirt-stained fingers as he dialed 911. The screen cracked slightly under the pressure of his grip. Dispatch, this is Tom Mitchell out on County Road 47. I think I found a body. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker. Can you repeat that, Mr. Mitchell? Human remains. In my field. Send Sheriff Morrison out here right away. Tom walked back to his truck, suddenly feeling every one of his 62 years. He sat on the tailgate and stared at the bone protruding from the earth, wondering whose life had ended here and how long they'd been waiting to be found. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of turned earth and growing corn from neighboring fields. Normal smells, familiar smells. But nothing about this morning felt normal anymore. Sheriff Kate Morrison arrived 23 minutes later, her patrol car kicking up clouds of dust as it bounced down the gravel road. She was a compact woman in her early 40s, with steel-gray eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for solving cases that stumped bigger departments in Wichita and Kansas City. Dr. Vivian Sarah, the county coroner, pulled up behind her in a white van loaded with equipment. Sarah was a precise woman who'd moved to Kansas from California 5 years earlier, seeking the quiet life of a small-town coroner. She hadn't expected to find much excitement in Millfield County. She'd been wrong. Together, they cordoned off a 20-foot square around the discovery site with yellow tape. Morrison took photographs from every angle while Sarah began the careful process of excavation, using brushes and small tools to expose the skeleton without disturbing the surrounding soil. How long you figure it's been here? Tom asked, unable to tear his eyes away from the emerging remains. He'd moved his truck back 50 yards, but he couldn't bring himself to leave entirely. Dr. Vivian brushed soil from what appeared to be a rib cage. Several ribs were cracked, one completely broken in half. Hard to say without proper examination, but based on the decomposition and the way the bones have settled into the soil matrix, I'd estimate 15 to 20 years. Maybe longer. Sheriff Morrison squatted beside the remains, careful not to disturb Vivian's work. Male from the size of the skull and pelvis. What do you think, Doc? Definitely male. Young adult. Maybe mid-20s based on bone density and the fusion of the epiphyses. Vivian pointed to various markers on the skeleton. And look at this. She indicated the back of the skull, where a spider web of fractures spread across the occipital bone like a broken eggshell. Blunt force trauma. Someone hit him hard with something heavy. This would have been immediately fatal. Morrison stood, her knees popping. Murder weapon? Nothing obvious in the immediate area. Could be anywhere by now, or destroyed entirely. Vivian continued her examination. But based on the fracture pattern, I'd say it was something like a hammer, crowbar, or tire iron. Something with a concentrated striking surface. Any idea who it might be? Tom's voice was barely above a whisper. We'll run DNA tests, check missing persons reports from the time frame. Morrison turned to study Tom's face. The farmer looked genuinely shocked, but there was something else there, a flicker of recognition, quickly suppressed. Tom, I need to ask, did you know about this? Know about it? Tom's eyes widened, but he couldn't quite meet Morrison's gaze. Hell no, Sheriff. This field's been in corn for the past 5 years. Before that, it was soybeans for 3 years. Before that, pasture for cattle. I plow it every spring, disc it every fall when it's in crop rotation. If there was a body here, I'd have found it long before now. Morrison nodded, but made a mental note. Tom was holding something back. She could see it in the way his hands shook slightly, the way he kept glancing toward the road as if planning an escape route. When did you first start farming this particular section? She asked. Bought it from the Henderson place about 12 years ago. Old man Henderson was looking to downsize, and I needed more acreage. Tom wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. Been working it regular since then. What about before that? Any idea what Henderson used it for? Pasture mostly. Maybe some hay. Nothing that would require deep cultivation. Morrison walked the perimeter of the crime scene, noting the layout. The field sat on a slight rise, visible from the county road but far enough away that someone working at night might not be seen. Trees lined the western edge, providing cover from the nearest neighbor's house. Dr. Vivian, Sarah, how much deeper do we need to go? I'd like to excavate at least 2 more feet in all directions. Make sure we're not missing anything. Personal effects, clothing remnants, maybe the murder weapon if we're lucky. Morrison turned back to Tom. I'm going to need you to stay available, Tom. Don't leave town without letting me know. I'm not going anywhere, Sheriff. Got corn to harvest and winter wheat to plant. But I want to know who this is as much as you do. As Morrison watched Tom drive away, she wondered if that was really true. 3 days later, Dr. Vivian called with results that would crack the case wide open and shake Millfield County to its foundation. Sheriff, you're going to want to sit down for this. Vivian's voice crackled through the phone speaker in Morrison's office. DNA came back with a match. The victim is Marcus Webb. Morrison felt her blood chill. She set down her coffee cup with hands that suddenly seemed unsteady. Marcus Webb? But that's impossible. Marcus died in a car accident 22 years ago. I was a rookie deputy then, but I remember it clear as day. We pulled his Chevy out of Cottonwood Creek. That's what I thought too. But I ran the DNA 3 times to be sure. Dental records confirm it as well. This is definitely Marcus Webb, which means the body they found in that car 22 years ago wasn't Marcus. Morrison finished the sentence, her mind racing. Jesus Christ. Someone wanted everyone to think Marcus was dead. There's more, Sheriff. I found some interesting things during the full examination, such as the victim had been wearing expensive clothes when he died. I found fabric remnants, silk tie, wool suit jacket, high-end stuff. And there was this. Morrison could hear Vivian moving around, probably reaching for evidence bags. A Rolex watch stopped at 11:47. The crystal was shattered, probably during the attack, but the mechanism was intact enough to get a serial number. I ran it through the database. And purchased at a jewelry store in Kansas City 3 weeks before Marcus supposedly died. Bought with cash by a man matching Marcus's description. Morrison leaned back in her chair, trying to process the implications. Marcus Webb had been Millfield's golden boy back in the day. Star quarterback at Millfield High, homecoming king, valedictorian. The kind of guy who seemed destined for great things, college scholarship, professional success, maybe even politics. His death at 25 had shaken the small Kansas town to its core. Dr. Vivian, I need you to pull every bit of evidence from that car accident 22 years ago. Every photograph, every report, every piece of physical evidence that's left. Already on it. But Sheriff, there's something else you should know. What? I called the state crime lab, asked them to run DNA on any remaining tissue samples from the John Doe in that car. They told me the body was cremated 2 weeks after the accident, per family request. Whose request? David Webb. Marcus's brother. Morrison felt pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to shift into place. David authorized cremation? Signed the papers himself. Said the family wanted to lay Marcus to rest as quickly as possible, given the traumatic nature of his death. After hanging up, Morrison sat in her office staring at the Marcus Webb file she'd pulled from the archives. The car accident report was surprisingly thin for such a significant case. Vehicle found submerged in Cottonwood Creek by a fisherman. Body badly burned from the fire that had consumed the car's interior. Identification made through dental records provided by Dr. Harold Brennan, the family dentist. No investigation into possible foul play. No questions about why a careful driver like Marcus Webb had ended up in the creek on a clear, dry night. The assumption had been that he'd fallen asleep at the wheel or swerved to avoid an animal. Now Morrison had to face an uncomfortable truth. Someone had murdered Marcus Webb and gone to elaborate lengths to cover it up. The question was who and why. She pulled out a legal pad and began making a list of people who might have wanted Marcus dead. At the top, she wrote 3 names: David Webb, Tom Mitchell, and Robert Hartwell. Morrison's first stop was the Webb family farm, a sprawling operation about 10 miles southeast of town. She found David Webb in the machine shed, welding a broken cultivator tooth with the methodical patience of a man who'd learned to make things last. David was 2 years younger than Marcus had been, but where Marcus had been tall and athletic, David was stocky and practical. The kind of man who could fix anything with baling wire and determination. He looked up when Morrison's patrol car pulled into the yard, shutting off the welder and pulling up his safety mask. Sheriff Morrison, what brings you out this way? David, I need to talk to you about Marcus. David's torch slipped from his fingers, clattering against the concrete floor. A small shower of sparks died quickly in the morning air. What about Marcus? He's been dead for over 20 years. That's just it, he hasn't been. Morrison explained about the body in Tom Mitchell's field, watching David's face carefully. Color drained from his cheeks like water from a broken dam. Someone staged that car accident, David. Made it look like Marcus died, when really he was murdered. David sank onto a hay bale, suddenly looking older than his 43 years. His hands shook as he removed his work gloves. I don't understand. Who would do such a thing? That's what I'm trying to find out. I need you to think back to that time. Was Marcus in any kind of trouble? Did he owe money? Have any enemies? David was quiet for a long moment, staring at his oil-stained hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with old pain and barely suppressed anger. Marcus wasn't the saint everyone thought he was, Sheriff. People saw what they wanted to see. The star quarterback, the honor student, the golden boy who was going to put Millfield on the map. But I lived with him. I knew the real Marcus. Tell me about the real Marcus. He was selfish. Reckless. He thought the rules didn't apply to him because he was special. David's voice grew harder. He had debts, gambling debts, mostly. Started in high school with football pools and scratch-off tickets. By the time he was 25, he was into some serious people for serious money. Morrison pulled out her notebook. How much money? Last I heard, about $50,000. And these weren't the kind of people who accepted payment plans. Anyone else who might have wanted Marcus gone? David hesitated, glancing toward the house where his wife was hanging laundry on the line. There was trouble with a woman. What kind of trouble? Her name was Lisa Hartwell. She was married to Robert Hartwell, the banker. Marcus was seeing her. Had been for months. It wasn't just some casual thing either. Marcus thought he was in love. Morrison felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift into place. How did Robert find out? Someone saw them together at a motel in Salina. Took pictures. Robert got an anonymous package in the mail about a week before Marcus supposedly died. David stood and walked to the shed door, staring out at the fields. Robert came here the next day, madder than I'd ever seen a man. Said he was going to destroy Marcus, make him pay for what he'd done to his family. Did he threaten Marcus directly? More than threaten. Robert said he was going to call in every loan Marcus had, ruin his credit, make sure he could never get a job in Kansas again. Said he had friends in law enforcement who owed him favors. Morrison made more notes. Anyone else who might have had it in for Marcus? David turned back to face her, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or fear. Well, there was the business deal that went south. What business deal? Marcus had convinced our parents to mortgage the farm to invest in some development project. Something about turning old farmland into a housing subdivision outside of Salina. The whole thing collapsed, and we almost lost everything. Dad had a heart attack from the stress. Died 6 months later. Morrison felt her pulse quicken. Who else was involved in the development deal? Couple of local guys with money to invest. Tom Mitchell was one of them. Robert Hartwell was another. He arranged the financing through his bank. How much money did they lose? Tom lost about $60,000. Robert's bank was on the hook for twice that. But Marcus? David's voice trailed off. What about Marcus? Marcus was supposed to be managing the project, handling the day-to-day operations. But after it collapsed, the investors found out that Marcus had been skimming money for months, using project funds to pay his gambling debts and finance his lifestyle. Morrison's pen stopped moving. How much did he steal? Near as anyone could figure, about $200,000. Money that was supposed to go to contractors, permits, materials. Marcus had been using it like his personal bank account. Did anyone file charges? They were going to. Tom and Robert came to see me about a week before Marcus died. Said they were giving Marcus one last chance to make it right before they went to the police. Morrison looked up from her notes. What did Marcus say when you confronted him? David's face darkened. That's just it, Sheriff. I never got the chance to confront him. He died before I could work up the courage to have that conversation. Something in David's tone suggested there was more to the story, but Morrison decided to save those questions for later. She had enough leads to keep her busy for days. As she drove away from the Webb farm, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that David Webb was hiding something significant about his brother's death. The question was whether he was hiding guilt or just shame. First National Bank of Millfield occupied a corner lot on Main Street, a red brick building that had anchored the town's business district for over 80 years. Robert Hartwell's office was on the second floor, overlooking the street through tall windows that had witnessed decades of small-town drama. The office itself was a shrine to small-town success, dark wood paneling, hunting trophies, and photographs of Robert shaking hands with various politicians. A glass case displayed golf trophies and civic awards, testament to a life lived in the public eye. Robert Hartwell himself was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the kind of smooth confidence that came from years of handling other people's money. At 67, he was still imposing, still commanded respect when he walked into the coffee shop or the church on Sunday morning. Sheriff Morrison, what brings you by? His smile didn't reach his eyes, and Morrison noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he gestured to a chair. I'm investigating the murder of Marcus Webb. Murder? I thought Marcus died in a car accident. Robert's voice was carefully controlled, but Morrison caught the slight hitch in his breathing. That's what someone wanted us to think. The truth is, Marcus was murdered, and his body was buried in Tom Mitchell's field for over 20 years. Robert's composure cracked just slightly, a tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible pause before he responded. That's terrible. Do you have any leads? I know about the affair, Mr. Hartwell. Between your wife and Marcus. Now Robert's mask slipped completely. His face flushed red, and his hands clenched into fists on the desktop. The controlled banker disappeared, replaced by a man whose carefully constructed world had been shattered by betrayal. That son of a bitch got what was coming to him. Did you kill him, Robert? No. The word came out strangled. But I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to. Morrison leaned forward in her chair. Tell me about that last week. Before Marcus disappeared, Robert stood and walked to the window, staring out at Main Street where normal people were going about their normal lives. His voice, when he spoke, was heavy with old pain. I'd suspected for months. Lisa was distant, distracted. She started working late at the library, taking weekend trips to visit her sister in Topeka. Said she needed space to think about our marriage. He turned back to Morrison. Except her sister called one day looking for her. Said Lisa hadn't visited in over 6 months. That's when I knew. What did you do? I hired a private investigator from Kansas City. Cost me $3,000, but I had to know. Robert's laugh was bitter. Got photos of them together at a motel in Salina. Video of them walking hand in hand through Riverside Park. 47 photographs documenting my wife's betrayal. Morrison made notes, watching Robert's face carefully. When did you confront Lisa? That Monday night, the night before Marcus supposedly died. I laid all the photos out on our kitchen table and waited for her to come home from another of her library meetings. How did she react? She broke down completely. Admitted everything. Said she was ending it, that it had all been a terrible mistake. Begged me to forgive her. Said she'd do anything to save our marriage. Robert's voice was bitter. I told her that if she ever saw Marcus Webb again, I'd destroy him. Ruin his family, call in every loan they had with my bank. Make sure they lost everything. Did you threaten Marcus directly? I went to see him that Tuesday morning, the day he supposedly died. Found him at the old grain elevator where he worked part-time. Told him to stay away from my wife or I'd make his life hell. Morrison looked up from her notes. How did Marcus respond? He laughed at me. Actually laughed. Said I was pathetic. That Lisa deserved better than a boring old banker. Said he was going to convince her to leave me and start fresh somewhere else. What happened then? I lost my temper. Grabbed him by the shirt. Shoved him against a wall. Told him I'd kill him before I'd let him destroy my family. Robert's hands shook as he reached for a glass of water on his desk. But kill him? No, Sheriff. I'm not a murderer. I went home that afternoon and spent the rest of the day trying to save my marriage. Morrison studied his face. Robert Hartwell was clearly hiding something. But was he hiding murder? What about the development deal? The money Marcus stole. Robert's expression hardened. That bastard cost my bank over $100,000 in bad loans. Money we had to write off when the project collapsed. If I'd known then what he was doing, you'd have killed him? I'd have sent him to prison where he belonged. Morrison closed her notebook. Mr. Hartwell, I need you to stay available for follow-up questions. I'm not going anywhere, Sheriff. I've lived in this town for 40 years. Built my reputation here. Raised my children here. Whatever Marcus Webb did, whatever happened to him, I won't let it destroy what I've spent my life building. As Morrison left the bank, she wondered if Robert Hartwell's reputation was worth killing for. Lisa Hartwell lived in the same Victorian house on Elm Street where she'd raised her children and endured 22 years of marriage to a man she'd betrayed. The house had seen better days. Paint peeling from the shutters, a front porch that sagged slightly under the weight of too many Kansas winters. Lisa answered the door herself, A woman in her mid-40s who might have been beautiful once but now looked worn down by guilt and regret. Her hands shook as she recognized Morrison, and she glanced nervously over her shoulder before stepping outside and closing the door behind her. "Mrs. Hartwell, I need to ask you about Marcus Webb." Lisa's face went white as freshly fallen snow. "Marcus? But he's been dead for 22 years, I know." "Except he wasn't dead, Mrs. Hartwell. Someone killed him and made it look like an accident. I need to know about your relationship with him." Lisa wrapped her arms around herself despite the warm afternoon sun. "We can't talk here. Robert, he doesn't know I've been thinking about Marcus lately. Having dreams." "What kind of dreams?" "Nightmares, really. About that last night I saw him." Lisa's voice dropped to a whisper. "Marcus came to see me the night before he supposedly died. He was scared, Sheriff. More scared than I'd ever seen him." Morrison pulled out her notebook. "Scared of what?" "He said someone was trying to kill him. Said he'd gotten in too deep with some people, and they weren't the type to forgive and forget." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "He begged me to run away with him. Said he had money saved up, that we could start fresh somewhere far from Kansas. But you didn't go." Lisa shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was a coward. I had my kids to think about, my reputation in this town. I told him I couldn't leave with him, that we had to end our relationship." "How did Marcus react?" "He said he understood, but that he was going to disappear anyway. Start fresh somewhere else." Lisa wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. "He said he'd found a way to fake his own death and collect on his life insurance policy." Morrison felt her pulse quicken. "Life insurance? How much?" $500,000. A fortune back then, especially for someone like Marcus. Who was the beneficiary? His parents were dead by then. His father died of a heart attack the year before, his mother from cancer when Marcus was in high school. I think it was his brother David." Morrison made careful notes. "Did Marcus explain how he planned to fake his death?" "He said he'd found someone to help him. Some transient who was passing through town, someone with no family or connections. Marcus was going to pay him to stage a car accident, make it look like Marcus died in the crash." "What happened to this transient?" "I don't know. Marcus said once everyone thought he was dead, he'd disappear for a few months, then collect the insurance money and start over with a new identity." Morrison looked up from her notes. "But you never saw Marcus again after that night?" "Never." The next day, everyone was talking about the terrible accident. How they'd pulled his car out of Cottonwood Creek with his body inside. Lisa's voice broke. "I went to the funeral, stood at the back of the church, and watched them bury an empty coffin. Did you suspect that Marcus might still be alive?" "For a while, yes. I kept expecting him to contact me, to send some signal that he'd made it out safely. But months passed, then years, and I never heard anything. Eventually, I assumed something had gone wrong with his plan." Morrison studied Lisa's face. The woman seemed genuinely distraught, but there was something else there. Relief, maybe, or the exhaustion that came from carrying a secret for too long. "Mrs. Hartwell, is there anything else you haven't told me? Anything that might help me find Marcus's killer?" Lisa was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "There was something Marcus said that last night. Something that didn't make sense at the time." "What?" "He said he'd been stupid to trust family. Said blood didn't mean anything when money was involved." Lisa looked up at Morrison with haunted eyes. "I thought he was just being dramatic, but now you think he meant someone in his family wanted him dead." David was the only family Marcus had left, and David would have inherited everything if Marcus died. Dr. Harold Brennan had been Millfield's dentist for over 40 years before retiring to a modest house on Maple Street. Morrison found him in his garden, tending to prize-winning roses with the same careful attention he'd once given to damaged teeth. At 78, Dr. Brennan was still sharp, still moved with the precise economy of motion that had made him one of the most trusted professionals in town. But when Morrison mentioned Marcus Webb, his pruning shears stilled in his hands. Dr. Brennan, I need to ask you about the dental identification you made 22 years ago. On the body from the car accident. The old man set down his tools and sank onto a garden bench, suddenly looking every one of his 78 years. What about it? The body you identified as Marcus Webb, it wasn't Marcus. Marcus was murdered and buried in a field. Which means you either made a mistake or I lied. Dr. Brennan removed his gardening gloves with hands that shook slightly. I've been waiting 22 years for someone to figure it out. Morrison sat beside him on the bench. Tell me what happened. David Webb came to see me the night after they pulled that car out of the creek. It was almost midnight. I remember because my wife complained about the doorbell waking her up. Dr. Brennan's voice grew heavy with regret. David was beside himself, crying, shaking like a leaf. Said there'd been a terrible accident. What kind of accident? According to David, Marcus had convinced some transient to help him fake his death. The plan was to stage the car accident, let everyone think Marcus died, then Marcus would disappear and start over somewhere else with the insurance money. Morrison leaned forward. But something went wrong. David said the transient, some drifter with no family, no one to miss him, was supposed to just set the car on fire and walk away. But he got trapped somehow. Maybe knocked unconscious in the crash. Maybe just overcome by smoke. Either way, he burned to death in that car. So David asked you to identify the body as Marcus? He said Marcus had panicked when he realized what happened. The transient was dead because of his plan, and Marcus was terrified that if the truth came out, he'd be charged with murder. David begged me to say the dental records matched, to let everyone think Marcus had died in the accident. Dr. Brennan stared at his roses, their perfect blooms a stark contrast to the ugly truth he was revealing. David was like a son to me, Sheriff. I delivered him, watched him grow up, fixed his teeth when he broke them playing football. When he came to me that night, desperate and scared, I couldn't turn him away. And you agreed to falsify the identification? David swore that Marcus would never come back, that as far as everyone was concerned, Marcus Webb was dead. One false identification, he said, would save the family from scandal and financial ruin. The old man's shoulders sagged. I told myself I was doing the right thing, protecting a family that had already suffered enough. Morrison made careful notes. What about the life insurance money? David swore he'd never touch it. Said he'd put it away for Marcus's funeral expenses and maybe help their mother if she needed it later. She was already sick with cancer by then. But Marcus never made it out of town, did he? Dr. Brennan shook his head slowly. I realize that now. Someone killed him before he could escape, and I helped cover it up by identifying that poor transient as Marcus. Morrison studied the old man's face. Dr. Brennan seemed genuinely remorseful, but she had to ask the hard question. Doctor, did David ever tell you what really happened to Marcus? No. I assumed Marcus had made it out of town safely and was starting a new life somewhere else. I never imagined. His voice trailed off. Never imagined what? That David might have been lying about everything. That maybe Marcus never had a chance to run away at all. Morrison found David Webb exactly where she'd expected. In his kitchen, a bottle of whiskey and a loaded shotgun laid out on the table like the props for a final scene. He looked up when she walked in, his eyes red with tears and sleepless nights. I've been waiting for you, Sheriff. Morrison carefully moved the shotgun out of reach, checking to make sure the safety was on before setting it aside. Want to tell me what really happened to Marcus? David poured whiskey into 2 glasses, pushed one toward her. Morrison left it untouched, but David drained his in one burning gulp. Marcus was always the golden boy, you know? Star athlete, popular, good-looking. Everything came easy to him. Everything except consequences. David refilled his glass, his hands steadier now that the moment had finally arrived. People in this town, they loved Marcus. Thought he could do no wrong. But I lived with him, Sheriff. I saw what he really was. And what was that? A selfish bastard who thought the world owed him everything. He'd charm people, make them trust him, then take whatever he wanted and move on to the next victim. Morrison pulled out her notebook, though she suspected she wouldn't need it. David Webb was ready to confess, had probably been ready for 22 years. Tell me about the development deal. Marcus convinced our parents to mortgage the farm. Said it was a sure thing that we'd make enough money to pay off the farm and have plenty left over. Dad was getting older, having health problems, and the idea of financial security was too tempting to pass up. David's voice grew harder, edged with old anger. But it wasn't just our money Marcus was playing with. He'd convinced Tom Mitchell to invest $60,000 Robert Hartwell's bank to finance the whole project. In total, about $500,000. And Marcus was stealing from the project? From the very beginning. He was supposed to be managing the construction, paying contractors, buying materials. Instead, he was skimming money to pay off gambling debts and finance his lifestyle. Expensive clothes, fancy dinners with his married girlfriend, trips to Kansas City for the casinos. Morrison made notes, though the picture was becoming clear. When did you find out? Tom figured it out first. He was keeping his own books. Noticed that the amounts Marcus claimed to have spent didn't match up with what was actually being done on the project. Tom came to me, showed me the discrepancies. What did you do? I confronted Marcus. This was about a week before he supposedly died. I showed him Tom's figures, demanded an explanation. David's laugh was bitter. Marcus didn't even try to deny it. Just shrugged and said he'd borrowed some money temporarily, that he'd pay it back when the project started generating profits. But there weren't going to be any profits. The whole development was a scam from the beginning. Marcus had convinced everyone to invest in land that couldn't be developed because of wetland regulations. He knew it from the start, but he needed the investment money to cover his other debts. Morrison looked up from her notes. So you, Tom, and Robert were going to lose everything. Worse than that. The loans were personally guaranteed. Dad would have lost the farm that had been in our family for 3 generations. Tom would have been bankrupt. Robert's bank would have taken a huge loss that might have forced it into receivership. What happened when you confronted Marcus with this? David's hands began to shake again. He reached for the whiskey bottle, but Morrison gently moved it away from him. Marcus said it didn't matter anymore. Said he'd found a way out that would solve everyone's problems. The insurance scam. $500,000 in life insurance. Enough to pay back the investors and leave plenty left over for Marcus to start fresh somewhere else. David's voice cracked. He showed me how he'd planned it all out. Found some vagrant to help stage the accident. Even picked out the spot where his car would go into the creek. Morrison felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. But you couldn't let him do it. It wasn't just about the money, Sheriff. Don't you see? If Marcus faked his death and disappeared, everyone would eventually figure out what he'd done. The insurance company would investigate. The truth would come out about the development scam, about all the money he'd stolen. Dad would still lose the farm, and Marcus would be long gone. So you decided to stop him. David nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. I want to see him that Tuesday night. Found him at the old grain elevator, waiting for his ride out of town. He had a suitcase full of cash money he'd skimmed from the project over the past year. What happened then? I begged him to stay and face what he'd done. Make it right somehow. But Marcus just laughed at me. Said I was a fool for working the farm all those years while he'd been living it up. Said once he collected that insurance money, he'd be set for life. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving streaks of dirt and tears across his cheeks. That's when he told me the worst part. Which was, He said he'd already talked to Dad about selling the farm. Convinced him it was the smart thing to do, that the development money would set us all up for retirement. Marcus was going to let Dad sell the farm to pay back the investors, then disappear with the insurance money while the rest of us dealt with the consequences. Morrison felt a chill run down her spine. Your father would have lost everything. Everything. The farm, his reputation, his health. Dad had already had one heart attack from the stress of the development deal going bad. Learning that his golden boy son had stolen everything and abandoned the family would have killed him. So you fought. We fought. Really fought for the first time since we were kids. Marcus picked up a tire iron that was lying near some old equipment, threatened to bash my head in if I tried to stop him. Said I was pathetic, that I'd always been jealous of him because he was smarter and better looking and more successful. David's voice grew hollow, as if he was reliving that night in vivid detail. I grabbed the tire iron away from him. We wrestled for it, both of us yelling, both of us furious. And then, you hit him. I didn't mean to kill him. I swear to God, Sheriff, I just wanted to stop him from running away. But when I swung that tire iron, trying to knock him down, I hit him in the back of the head. The sound. David shuddered. Like a watermelon hitting concrete. What did you do then? Marcus dropped like a stone. All that blood pooling under his head, his eyes staring at nothing. I knew he was dead before I even checked for a pulse. Morrison made careful notes, watching David's face for any sign of deception. But the man seemed genuinely broken, genuinely remorseful. So you buried him in Tom Mitchell's field? Not right away. First I panicked. Sat there for maybe an hour, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't call the police. Who would believe it was an accident? I just killed the town's golden boy over money. They'd have put me away for life. When did you decide to use the insurance scam? That's when I remembered the transient Marcus had found to help stage the car accident. Some vagrant who'd been hanging around the grain elevator for a few days, looking for work. Marcus had shown him to me earlier that week, said this was the guy who was going to die in his place. Morrison looked up from her notes. Where was this transient? Passed out drunk in an old boxcar about a mile from the elevator. Marcus had given him a bottle of whiskey and told him to wait there until it was time to stage the accident. David's voice grew quieter. I went and found him, brought him back to where Marcus was lying. What happened to the transient? I put him in Marcus's car, drove it to the spot where the accident was supposed to happen. The plan was to knock him unconscious, set the car on fire, and make it look like Marcus had died in a crash. Morrison felt her stomach turn. But something went wrong. The transient woke up while I was pouring gasoline around the car. Started fighting me, trying to get away. In the struggle, he hit his head on the steering wheel, knocked himself unconscious again. I thought he was just out cold. But he wasn't. David shook his head, fresh tears streaming down his face. I lit the fire and walked away, thinking he'd wake up and escape once the flames got hot enough. But he never did. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. He burned to death in that car. Morrison set down her pen. So you'd killed 2 men. 2 men died because of me, yes. Marcus because I lost my temper, and that poor vagrant because I was too much of a coward to face what I'd done. David looked directly at Morrison for the first time since his confession began. I've lived with that guilt every day for 22 years. What did you do with Marcus's body? Tom helped me bury him. I called Tom that night, told him what had happened. He came out to the grain elevator, helped me load Marcus into his truck. We drove to Tom's field, the one where you found the body, and buried him there. Morrison made more notes. Why that particular field? It was pasture then. Hadn't been plowed in years. Tom said no one would ever think to look there, and even if they did, the body would be too deep to find. David's laugh was bitter. We never figured Tom would decide to turn that field into cropland 20 years later. What about Dr. Brennan? How did you convince him to identify the vagrant's body as Marcus? I went to see him that night, told him what had happened. Not the whole truth. I said Marcus had panicked when the transient died accidentally, that Marcus had run away to avoid being charged with manslaughter. Asked Dr. Brennan to identify the body as Marcus so the family wouldn't be destroyed by scandal. Morrison studied David's face. And he believed you? He wanted to believe me. Dr. Brennan was a good man who'd known our family for decades. When I told him Marcus was alive but couldn't come back, that identifying the vagrant as Marcus would save the family farm and spare everyone a lot of pain, he agreed to help. What about the insurance money? I told Dr. Brennan I'd never touch it. Said it would go toward funeral expenses and helping our mother with her medical bills. But after Mom died, David's voice trailed off. You used it to save the farm. Dad was already sick from the stress of the development deal collapsing. Learning the truth about Marcus would have killed him. So I used the insurance money to pay back the investors. Tom got his $60,000. Robert's bank got paid in full. Everyone thought it was money from Marcus's life insurance policy. Morrison closed her notebook. And your father never knew what really happened. Never. He lived another 6 years thinking his oldest son had died in a tragic accident. It broke his heart, but at least he died believing Marcus was a victim rather than a thief and a murderer. David reached for the whiskey bottle again, and this time Morrison didn't stop him. I know what I did was wrong, Sheriff. I've known it every day for 22 years. But I couldn't let Marcus destroy our family. I couldn't let Dad lose everything because of his son's greed. Morrison stood up, her hand moving to her handcuffs. David Webb, you're under arrest for the murder of Marcus Webb and the death of John Doe. You have the right to remain silent. As she read David his rights, Morrison reflected on the tragic irony of the case. David Webb had killed his brother to save the family farm and reputation, then spent 22 years living with the guilt of that moment. In the end, the truth had come out anyway, and the Webb family name would be destroyed just as thoroughly as if Marcus had succeeded in his insurance scam. Tom Mitchell was waiting in Sheriff Morrison's office when she returned from arresting David Webb. He sat slumped in a chair, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in the past week. His usual farmer's tan had faded to a sickly pallor, and his hands shook as he removed his baseball cap. I heard you arrested David, he said without preamble. Morrison sat behind her desk, studying Tom's face. He confessed to killing Marcus. Also confessed that you helped bury the body. Tom nodded slowly. I figured he would. David's been carrying that guilt for 22 years. Probably a relief to finally get it out. Is that why you're here, Tom? To confess your part in this? Partly. Tom twisted his cap in his hands. But there's more to the story than what David told you. Morrison pulled out a fresh notebook. I'm listening. David called me that night, like he said. But he didn't tell me the whole truth about what happened at the grain elevator. What did he leave out? Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. I was there, Sheriff. I saw the whole thing. Morrison felt her pulse quicken. You witnessed the murder? I'd been tracking Marcus for days, trying to figure out what he was planning. I knew something was up. He'd been acting strange, spending money he didn't have, talking about leaving town. When I followed him to the grain elevator that night, I saw David was already there. Why were you following Marcus? Because I knew he was planning something with that insurance policy. $500,000 was too much money for Marcus to walk away from, even if it meant faking his own death. Tom looked up at Morrison. I couldn't let him do it. Why not? Because I knew Marcus, Sheriff. Better than David did. Better than anyone. Marcus wasn't the type to disappear quietly and never come back. Sooner or later, he'd get greedy or careless, and the truth would come out. When it did, everyone who'd been involved in that development deal would go down with him. Morrison made notes. So you went to the grain elevator to confront Marcus yourself. I got there just as David and Marcus started fighting. Heard them yelling at each other. Saw Marcus pick up that tire iron. I was going to intervene, try to calm things down, but then David killed Marcus. It happened so fast. 1 minute they were wrestling over the tire iron. The next minute Marcus was on the ground with his skull caved in. Tom's voice shook. David was in shock, just standing there staring at the body. That's when I stepped in. Morrison leaned forward. What did you do? Took charge of the situation. David was falling apart, talking about calling the police and confessing everything. I knew that would destroy both our families, so I convinced him we could still make Marcus's plan work. The insurance scam. Marcus had already set everything up, found the transient, picked out the location for the fake accident, even written a note that looked like a suicide confession in case the insurance company got suspicious. Tom's hands clenched into fists. All we had to do was follow through with Marcus's plan, except instead of Marcus disappearing, he'd be permanently out of the picture. Morrison felt a chill run down her spine. You killed the transient. Not intentionally. I put him in Marcus's car, drove to Cottonwood Creek, set the whole thing up to look like an accident. But when I tried to knock him unconscious so he could escape after the fire started, I hit him too hard. Crushed his skull just like David had done to Marcus. So you let him burn? Tom nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. I stood there and watched that car burn with a man inside it. Listened to him scream for maybe 30 seconds before the smoke got him. Then I walked home and pretended nothing had happened. Morrison made careful notes. What about Marcus's body? David wanted to call the police, confess everything. But I convinced him that would just make things worse. We'd both go to prison, our families would be ruined, and it wouldn't bring anyone back to life. Tom wiped his eyes. So we buried Marcus in my field, deep enough that no one would ever find him. Why your field specifically? It was pasture then, hadn't been disturbed in years. I figured it would stay that way forever. Never imagined I'd decide to farm it decades later. Morrison studied Tom's face. There's something else, isn't there? Tom hesitated, then nodded. The insurance money. David thinks he used it to pay back the investors, but that's not exactly true. What do you mean? I convinced David to let me handle the financial arrangements. Told him I'd make sure everyone got paid back fairly. But I kept $50,000 for myself, compensation for my losses and my silence. Morrison felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. So you profited from Marcus's death. I told myself I deserved it. I'd lost $60,000 in that development scam, spent 22 years keeping quiet about 2 murders. $50,000 seemed like a reasonable price for my troubles. What about Dr. Brennan? Did he know the truth? No. David handled that part of the cover-up. Dr. Brennan thought he was helping Marcus escape justice for accidentally killing the transient. He never knew that Marcus was already dead. Morrison closed her notebook. Tom Mitchell, you're under arrest for the murder of John Doe and accessory to the murder of Marcus Webb. You have the right to remain silent. As she read Tom his rights, Morrison marveled at how a single act of violence had rippled through the community for over 2 decades. 3 men were dead. 2 families were destroyed, and the truth had finally surfaced in the most mundane way possible, a farmer plowing his field. The trial of David Webb and Tom Mitchell dominated headlines in Millfield County for 6 months. It was the biggest criminal case in the county's history, drawing reporters from Kansas City and even a few national news outlets interested in the small-town murder conspiracy. David pled guilty to manslaughter in the death of Marcus Webb and received a sentence of 15 years in state prison. His cooperation with prosecutors and obvious remorse convinced the judge to show leniency, but David would still spend most of his remaining productive years behind bars. Tom Mitchell was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of the transient, whose identity was never established despite extensive investigation. DNA analysis suggested he was probably from the Southwest, possibly Arizona or New Mexico, but no missing person reports matched his description. He was buried in Millfield Cemetery under a simple headstone that read, "Unknown Victim. May he rest in peace." Tom received a sentence of 25 years to life. At 62, he would likely die in prison. Dr. Harold Brennan was charged with falsifying official records and obstruction of justice. Given his advanced age and cooperation with the investigation, he received 2 years of probation and community service. The Kansas Board of Dental Examiners revoked his license posthumously after he died of a heart attack 3 months after the trial ended. The Webb family farm was sold at auction to pay legal fees and civil judgments. The insurance company sued David's estate for the fraudulent payout, plus interest and penalties. After 22 years of compound interest, the judgment totaled over $2 million. Robert Hartwell was cleared of any involvement in Marcus's death, though his reputation in Millfield never fully recovered. The revelation of his wife's affair became the subject of gossip that followed him to his grave. He died of a stroke 2 years after the trial, a broken man who'd lost everything that mattered to him. Lisa Hartwell filed for divorce 2 weeks after David's conviction became public. She moved to Kansas City with her children and changed her name back to her maiden name. She never remarried and rarely spoke of her time in Millfield. The First National Bank of Millfield was eventually sold to a larger regional bank after Robert's death. The new owners razed the old building and built a modern branch office that bore no resemblance to the institution Robert Hartwell had spent his life building. Sheriff Kate Morrison stood in what had once been Tom Mitchell's field on a crisp October morning, watching as the Kansas Bureau of Investigation finished processing the crime scene. The harvest was done, and the field lay bare under an endless sky that seemed to stretch all the way to Colorado. 22 years was a long time to keep a secret. Long enough for guilt to eat away at a man's soul, for lies to compound into tragedy, for justice to seem like a distant memory. But the truth had a way of surfacing eventually, like bones pushed up from dark earth by the relentless cycle of seasons. Marcus Webb hadn't been a saint. He'd been a thief, a liar, and a cheat who'd betrayed everyone who'd trusted him. But he hadn't deserved to die in a grain elevator, his body hidden away like some shameful secret. He'd deserved his day in court, his chance to make amends or face the consequences of his actions. The transient whose name no one would ever know had deserved even better. He'd been a victim of circumstance, a man whose only crime had been accepting Marcus's offer of easy money. He'd died horribly, alone and afraid, because 2 other men were too cowardly to face the truth. David Webb would likely spend the rest of his life in prison, his family's reputation destroyed, their legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the price of keeping secrets. Tom Mitchell would die behind bars, his own family forced to bear the shame of his crimes. Dr. Brennan had died believing he'd done the right thing, never knowing that his act of compassion had helped cover up 2 murders. His reputation, built over 40 years of service to the community, would be forever tainted by one moment of misguided loyalty. None of it would bring Marcus Webb back. None of it would restore the transient's life or give him the dignity of a proper burial under his real name. But in a small Kansas town where everyone knew everyone else's business, some secrets were too big to stay buried forever. Morrison climbed into her patrol car and drove back toward town, leaving the empty field behind. Tomorrow there would be other cases, other mysteries to solve. But tonight, she could sleep knowing that Marcus Webb's story had finally been told, that justice, delayed but not denied, had finally been served. In the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled over the field, riding the thermals up into the vast Kansas sky. Below, the earth kept its watch, patient and silent, ready to receive whatever seeds the next season might bring. The wheat would grow again next spring, green shoots pushing up through the dark soil toward the sun. But some harvests, Morrison reflected as she drove toward the setting sun, were 22 years in the making. The truth, like the Kansas wind, was relentless and eternal. It might be delayed by human weakness and covered by human lies, but it would always find a way to surface. In a place where the horizon stretched endlessly in all directions, where the sky was so big it made human secrets seem small and temporary, the truth was the only thing that lasted. Marcus Webb was finally at rest. The transient whose name would never be known had finally been acknowledged as a victim rather than a prop in someone else's crime. And in Millfield, Kansas, the long-buried secrets of a summer night 22 years ago had finally been brought to light. Justice, like the wheat harvest, came in its own season, but it always came. The end. We encourage you to like and subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed the video. Please share your thoughts in the comments section and explore our channel for a diverse range of content, including audiobooks, murder mysteries, psychological thrillers, and classic novels. We strive to provide comprehensive and engaging storytelling experiences. Your visit is highly appreciated, and we are confident you will find content to your liking.